from my understanding, there's a department at the Lord's base in Havana, and they call them cyber ciberclarias.
Yeah.
Claria being a type of fish, and I don't know how, but Cubans do come up with weird words. But they're basically cyber warriors, and these people are trained from, since they went to the university for computer science, whatever, and they're picked and they're trained. And all these people do is sit on the internet all day long and counter anything that is said critical of the regime.
All right, this is take 3, the Liberated Podcast, where we talk about ways that we understand, secure, and exercise freedom. I am your frustrated host, Nick Jiménez, here with guest Alberto De La Cruz, managing editor of BabalúBlog.com. Thank you, Alberto, for being here with me and Petey and bearing with all these technical difficulties.
Nick, it's a pleasure to be here and happy to be on the podcast with you, and good to see you after so many years.
So, Alberto and I know each other through Babalú Blog. This hadn't come up in previous takes, but I actually did contribute to Babalú Blog
yes, you did.
For stretches.
Yeah, you did.
So Babalú Blog is a Cuban-American blog. There's a lot of heavy on politics, especially Cuba policy and Cuban human rights stuff, but also some culture stuff. This Babalú is also how I met past Pan Con podcast guest Marta Darby.
Right.
So a lot going on there that's Cuba related, Cuba centric, Cuba adjacent. And rather than have this be a conversation about Cuba and Cuba policy, we are going to sort of let that come into the conversation organically in discussions of the blog and blogging and the internet. In your experience as a tool for that kind of liberty-minded activism, for lack of a, better word. So, for the time 1.5, give us a bit of a summary of Babalú Blog, its genesis and your experience and history with the website.
Sure. Well, Babalú was founded started publishing back in 2003. It was created it was the brainchild and the idea and the baby of a good friend of mine who I met there and has become my brother from another mother, Val Prieto. Val had this idea to create a blog and start talking about Cuba and Cuban culture. In 2003, which was when blogs started coming out, and this had become a very popular medium, and a lot of people were putting blogs out, but it wasn't like today where anybody can go in and create their own website and start posting stuff, 5 minutes with all these tools that are online. Back then you had to actually go there, find the program you were going to use, set it up, get the graphics,
right,
get an IP, get a hosting service. There was none of this, hosted on somebody else's website. You had to get your own and get your own domain name and all that. So the people who were doing it were people who were serious and really wanted to do it, and weren't just people who were interested in going out there and to drop bombs and throw bombs and stuff like that. These were serious people that wanted to get out there, and Val was one of those. And Babalú started, and it quickly got a big following. I was one of those people that started reading it shortly after it came out. Ended up meeting Val. I had created my own little website as well, my own little blog, and talking to Val, he invited me to come and start writing with them as well. And Babalú had just was such a great place to write because you were reaching so many people. So I kind of let go of mine and started writing there, and eventually I became, a few years, I think it was can't remember what year it was, became the managing editor, and I've been keeping the blog running for at least the past 10 years. Yeah.
And
so,
the other, call it primary contributor these days is Carlos Eire, right?
Yeah, the other, we have 3 or 4 primary contributors that are on the website. I do most of the posting on there, and it's just basically to keep the news about Cuba out there and keeping information flowing. But the other writer that we have who contributes on a regular basis is Dr. Carlos Eire, who's a professor of religious history at Yale University. He was the author of Waiting for Snow in Havana, which won the National Book Award. An incredible book. If anybody out there listening hasn't read it, I highly recommend it. And the sequel to it, which was Waiting to Die in Miami.
Right.
But very talented writer, an incredible person, and him and I have actually become close friends. And one of the nicest, most incredible people you'll ever want to meet. And for me, he'd never say it, but one of the most intelligent people I've ever met.
Yeah.
Having a conversation with him is, especially when he starts getting into history, is just simply amazing.
At what point does he come on board and start writing for the blog?
He came on in about 2008, 2009. He started. He did a couple of. We kind of saw his work right after Waiting for Snow in Havana came out. He had written some articles. We saw it. We kind of featured it. And he was actually reading our blog as well. Yeah. And so we reached out to him and we started talking, and then he started sending us some guest posts, and then we became friends and started talking more, and he would visit Miami for whatever, and then we'd get together with him, and then I remember asking him one day, "Hey Carlos, are you interested in writing on a regular basis on Babalu?" And I remember he told me, he goes, "Look, I live in New Haven, Connecticut. I got nothing of Cuba here. This is like the only thing I have, and I would love to." And he's been great at keeping stuff going on the blog. But for him, it's therapeutic.
Yeah. Well, and for the blog, I imagine nobody could have told you, or Val, in those very, very early stages, that you would have like a Yale professor of religious history and National Book Award winner contributing on a pretty regular basis to the website.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. It's amazing the how Babalu has grown and has evolved over the years from a lot of, I don't know if you can cuss.
Oh, go for it.
From a lot of shit posting that we did in the beginning, which was like just us having fun, to a place where serious issues are dealt with, are written about, and but we still do the shit posting.
Right. Yeah.
We still like to have fun doing it, but it's really has evolved because it's become a place where a lot of people that you would never suspect. I've run into people that I would never imagine would ever read Babalu, and say, "Oh, I read you guys all the time," and I'm like,
"Yeah." Talk a bit about speaking of that development. Let's go back to the technical side, right? Like what the capability of a blog was in the beginning, and what tools you've had come into your arsenal since then, for lack of a better word, right? So we talked in take 1 about Blog Talk Radio and that kind of thing. So just talk about like on the technical side, what you guys were capable of as this small niche blog on the internet in the beginning, and what that looks like now.
Sure. Well, as I said, Babalu started when the whole blogging thing started, and of course, as everybody knows, blogging was dominated, and continues, to a certain degree, be dominated by conservative people on the center right and on the right side, conservative writers, because it was the only way you can get your information out, because the media wouldn't publish you. So what ended up happening is we started connecting with all these different bigger conservative outlets, blogs that were out there, such as Hot Air, Pajamas Media, and things like that. And then they started helping, and that's how the whole blogging thing was. It was a community. We'd help each other. We would bring content from Pajamas Media to our mostly Cuba-centric readers, and they would bring Cuba-related content to their mostly U.S., domestic policy readers.
Right.
So it kind of grew organically that way by intermixing with the two. So
and it ended up being a sort of utilitarian growth too, right? Because for them it filled a gap. Like they brought in Latin America and Caribbean related content that otherwise they wouldn't have been equipped to create.
Exactly.
And you had this relationship that brought stuff into you that you were able to treat as a well for.
Right. So it was, like I said, it was very organic, very synergistic.
Sure.
Relationship between everybody. Everybody helped each other out. We would go to these blog conferences and stuff, and it was like seeing old friends, even though you had never met before and you had never even spoken on the phone. It was just emails. You meet them at a conference like you've known each other for years. Just you read, we all wrote from the heart. So you kind of, when you meet the people, you're kind of seeing who they really are. So it was a lot of fun, and we used a lot of, as we discussed in the earlier take, Blog Talk Radio, which was the precursor to what we have now in podcasts.
Right.
But Blog Talk Radio was basically like a radio station on the internet, and you had to like reserve a block of time or you can buy a block of time. And
got it. I had forgotten that aspect of it. Yeah.
So you can broadcast. So we used to have a weekly show that was on there. We had great guests. I remember, and we may have had some ghosts. I don't know, but. One time we had Senator, before he was Senator Marco Rubio, we had Marco Rubio on when he was actually running for Senate back in 2010. We had a lot of great people on that show, but it becomes difficult because I believe our time slot was 9 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night on a Sunday.
Yeah,
and it's hard to get people to come on your show.
Because this would have been about what year?
About 2009, 2010.
Yeah, so because I remember it must have been my senior year of college in 2009. I remember tuning in and maybe even joining you guys for a thing there, because back then I was very involved with Raíces de Esperanza.
That's right. Yeah.
And there may have been
we did a show on that.
Yeah, there may have been a conference or something that we did a show on that. Which down the road in this conversation, I want to turn to Raíces things. Right, exactly. So. So there was at the beginning, and then the Blog Talk Radio, and we don't have to run through. I think it's sort of like common knowledge. What sorts of other things have emerged since then, like even just things like the increased ease of video.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of evolution, on the internet. Obviously, everybody knows that. And what happens with the blogs is the blogs used to be a strictly organic thing. The people that went to your blog were going straight to they were typing in babalublog.com and hitting return,
right?
Or they were saved as a bookmark. And back in those days, 80% of our traffic was direct traffic. The other 20% was Google search, or someone had posted one of our articles and linked it back to us. And fledgling social media. As social media started dominating the whole entire internet, we started seeing that number invert, and it went from 80% direct traffic to Babalu to down to 20, 30, at most 40% direct traffic, and the rest coming from social media, because people started looking at social media as the place to go, and then the hub, and then from that hub they would click to whatever article they wanted to read. So as we saw that happening, we took advantage of it, and we got a page on Facebook, we got a Twitter feed going, Instagram I can't figure out. I no le veo la gracia. I know it's you have big reach, but I can't. I look at it and it's like,
it's tough.
I don't know what to do here.
Yeah,
so
especially for content. Especially for content like what's on Babalu, because you're asking people to move from this very quick scroll, tap.
We're not pictures and we're not taking. Babalu is not what we had for dinner last night, or taking selfies at the beach. So I really don't see how. I'm sure there's a way, but I haven't been able to figure it out. But Facebook became, like the gatekeeper. And back in 2018, Facebook decided we were getting a little too much traffic.
Okay.
And they shadow banned us mid-May 2018. I can't tell you the exact date. I know it's mid-May because I still saved the graph. Facebook gave you these insight tools where you could see your traffic coming in, and I remember seeing, all this traffic, and then that around the middle of May in 2018, it just dropped by 2/3.
So this is an interesting
impressions.
Yeah. So the shadow ban is a thing that's thrown around a lot, and at least in the instances where I hear it referenced and then look into it, it ends up being a lot of people referring to a lot of different things with different levels of confirmation and evidence and whatever. So, unpack that a little more.
Sure. When I say shadow ban, this is the way I look at it. Our blog, our website automatically, whenever an article gets posted, it automatically gets posted onto the Babalú Blog Facebook page.
Yeah.
And what I started seeing was you would see an article, and as the admin on that page, I see the impressions, how many people it's reached. So I used to go in, check it, and a post had been up for an hour, you'd have 150, 200 people reached.
Yeah.
From, at that time we had about 3,600 followers. That's another thing. But we had about 3,600 followers on the page. And you'd see in about an hour, you get 100, 150 impressions. Then one day, all of a sudden, I see a post had been up in an hour and it had 14 impressions. Like,
sure, yeah.
How can, I go, well, maybe the post is boring.
Right.
Maybe this is something that people aren't really interested in. So I'm going to keep an eye on it. And I started seeing that number. And that's when I went to the insight part of the page, and I noticed that big drop off that came, because there was also, along with that big drop off, was a big drop off in traffic to the website, because less people see it, less people are clicking on the link to read the article.
Right.
So for me, the shadow banning, what it means, in my head, in my definition, is that Facebook was throttling how many people would see that actual post.
Okay.
So you asked, of course we asked, got zero answer.
Right.
So one of our admin on the website, Henry Gomez, who was also the editor before I was, he said, maybe it's what they want is, they want us to pay. So, we got a little bit of money in the till. Let's do it. Even with paying, I would never be able to get the impressions that we used to get organically.
Yeah.
So we tried it. Let's take a couple of articles that we know, this is, let's do an article on how the Miami Cuban sandwich is the best and that Tampa's Cuban sandwich is a heresy.
Right.
That's guaranteed,
just the Miami traffic alone.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's do that and let's promote it. 50, 60 impressions.
Sure, yeah.
So you can see that it's sort of, there's something going on there. We're not entirely sure. Maybe the fact that we're constantly blasting communism and socialism and things of that nature probably puts us in a category that, they don't want to promote. I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder whether it could be something, for lack of a better word, like more innocent. Like maybe there's something about the kind of keywords that they are trying to push or types of engagement that they prefer. Like as an example, I know ever since they started prioritizing their own native video stuff, the links to YouTube videos don't perform quite as well because they want all that inside and they want to keep ad dollars or whatever. But it could also. I
mean, I don't want to assign because we're a little tiny speck.
Right.
So I don't think someone in Facebook
they've got somebody assigned to the Babalu.
I'm going to get those Babalu.
Yeah.
Right winger Cuban Americans.
Yeah, Zuckerberg gets his Babalu brief every day.
Yeah, I don't think it's that. I think they just they're suppressing highly political. posts that go in a certain, because I see a lot of highly political things in the other direction, but I don't think it's like we were specifically targeted. I think we set off a lot of things on their algorithm.
Sure. Yeah.
And probably ended up getting us some type of shadow ban, some suppression of our impressions, and so. But it is what it is. There's really, there's really nothing that we can do about it. And I'll give you a perfect example. When this whole COVID thing happened, started, we're posting an article about COVID cases and deaths in Cuba, an actual news. This is not talking about, COVID is a hoax or, nothing like that. We're just, and immediately you would get, Facebook would give us a warning. You're talking about COVID. Make sure you have no misinformation on there. It's a news.
Right.
And sure enough, any article that mentions COVID is highly suppressed.
Yeah.
So, I stopped talking about COVID because, for a while there, that's all, all the news that's going out had to do with COVID.
Right.
And if you just mention it, and I guess you're not on their white list of websites that can talk about it,
right?
You're suppressed.
Yeah, there was an example, not COVID. Well, I guess you can draw a line, a loose line to COVID, but I don't know if you saw any of Reason's posting and reporting about the homemade baby formula posts.
Yeah, well, I heard that they were getting
so there was like a picture of an old homemade baby formula recipe. In case somebody's listening to this in the year 2030, at the time we're recording this, there's a baby formula shortage. So Reason magazine writes a thing about that Facebook, putting warnings and what have you, and then Reason starts putting similar warnings, or Facebook starts putting similar warnings on Reason's reporting of the warnings. So it gets to the point that some of it feels so automated that it's sort of a catch-22, right? And if you're being charitable to Facebook, it's like, okay, even if you agree with the goals that they're setting, it's goals that it takes a human to understand the goal and to implement and try to achieve them in any way that makes any kind of sense, because otherwise you end up suppressing, and putting warnings on and blurring out stories about stories about stories. So talking about who's watching and, surveilling and trying to do whatever, I think that's a good segue into a thing that we also lost in take one. Sort of the opposite impact, right? Like where maybe on this side you had indications that led you to think that traffic and what have you was suffering because of certain topics or keywords or whatever. Talk about traffic from Cuba. And earlier we were talking about the Cuban state trolls,
right.
And I think that to some degree that's a sign that you're doing something right? That the enemies of freedom would be so interested as to send their internet minions, but also talk a bit about the non-state actors in Cuba, right? Whether it's dissidents or just everyday people who may have come into your content or maybe communicated with you guys. I don't know if at some point, maybe somebody sent you a picture or a video or whatever. I think that maybe is the more interesting arc, right, of how advances in technology have changed things.
Yeah, that's one thing I've sort of done, have made an effort to do more of, and that is to get information directly from Cuba translated into English and onto the website. And in that sense, I've been able to, and mainly through social media, been able to connect with dissidents that are on the island, and get their information and translate it into English and post. As a matter of fact, yesterday I had a post of a mother with 3 children that got evicted in Havana from where she was living with her 3 kids, and they videotaped, or they, with a camera phone or whatever, they took the video of state security like knocking down the door and grabbing her and the kids screaming. That was unheard of 5-10 years ago. that you would be able to get. We got them 5 years ago. They were very few and far between. As a matter of fact, I think you and we had a discussion about that on how to help. We were talking about ideas on how to help that, but that was unheard of back then. And now those videos are getting out, and you see what happened in the protests on July 11th, when that protest started, and all that information was getting out of the island. The second thing the Cuban regime did, first thing they did was send out the troops and the Black Berets and the state security thugs and all that. The second thing they did was bring down the internet.
Right.
And they knocked down the internet basically on almost the entire island.
Yeah.
The only places left with internet were government facilities and a couple of hotels.
Yeah.
And that's how dissidents were able to still keep getting, because they would get close to a hotel, be able to get a Wi-Fi, and be able to get the information out, or have a tourist do it for them.
Yeah, and I remember that it was also in that sort of rolling outage kind of way, which is, from the perspective of the dictatorship, an intelligent way to handle it, right? Because you can always say, like, oh no, we just had an outage and it lasted a day, and you had internet from like
they rolled
odd hours, and
as more they were monitoring. They were sitting there and watching what was going on, and they were monitoring. And as the protest spread into new cities, when it would spread to a new city, they would cut the internet off in that city. And we have to remember, it was the Chinese is the ones who set up the whole telecom system,
right,
for Cuba. So that's all set up the way it's set up in China.
Yeah,
highly monitored, censored, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, so designed with that in mind.
Designed with the ability to be able to shut it off in certain places, and then say, "Oh, what are you talking about? Look, the internet's on. You see, but you can shut it off, in a specific neighborhood."
Yeah.
So, and that's the other thing. You don't really have, hardwired, cable modems or DSL or any of, or let alone fiber optic. You don't really have lines of internet coming into homes. 99% of the, I'm making that number up, but I'm assuming 99% of the internet in Cuba is via 3G.
Yeah.
Mobile, because they don't have the infrastructure to do it otherwise. So that makes it a lot easier. If you can shut off specific towers, shut off data on specific towers, you can isolate specific neighborhoods.
Right. So let's go back to the successful connections with people in Cuba. So again, let's start with the trollery. Talk about, because I think it's an idea that is foreign even to a lot of Cuban Americans who have not taken this kind of a deep dive into the realm of like publicly talking about Cuba, and to the point where you'd be attracting some of those characters. So talk about what that looks like on your end, and what you know about how that troll the Cuban internet troll operation functions. Yeah,
the Cuban trolls, they remain mainly.
And these are Cuban.
From what
Cuban government trolls.
Let me go back. From my understanding, there's a department at the Lord's base in Havana, and they call them cyber ciberclarias.
Yeah.
Claria being a type of fish, and I don't know how, but Cubans do come up with weird words. But they're basically cyber warriors, and these people are trained from, since they went to the university for computer science, whatever, and they're picked and they're trained. And all these people do is sit on the internet all day long and counter anything that is said critical of the regime. They come in and they counter it. They attack anyone who is criticizing the regime. The Chinese do it. The Russians do it. The Iranians do it. Every despotic dictatorship has their little cyber warrior troops that go out and do this. So Cuba has their own. The disadvantage that they have is that they are really bad at arguing in English.
Okay.
So they started trying to. The ones that that went and he can went to school and studied English for 5 years, and he can come here and he can order his lunch and he can defend himself, but he can't get into a philosophical, political
this is
argument. But they tried.
Shit posting fluency.
Right. So it's like, as the Cubans say, "Vinieron a bailar a casa de trompo." They came trying to argue in English in a country where English is not their first language. So they gave that up real quick. I had fun with a few in the beginning, but I would notice that immediately once they saw they couldn't keep up, they would switch to Spanish.
Right.
And to try to defend themselves, they would switch to Spanish, and I would answer them in English and keep answering, and then they would give up. But they do it mostly in Spanish, and they go after. Right now, from what I'm seeing, they go after mostly other people in Spanish. But it's basically they all have the same thing. You're a gusano, you're a worm. Your parents oppressed Afro-Cubans. That's why your parents left Cuba. Yeah. I was born here.
And the purpose of all of this, again, for the benefit of the person who is not familiar, it's not really so much to like beat you down. They have an audience in mind, right? The person who maybe is having their eyes opened by something that a Cuban American is saying, they want to be there to make sure they're reinforcing the propaganda that person had gotten to that point. Because there's a lot of people who come to Babalu, maybe they've never heard these perspectives, but they had always heard that all of these crazy Cuban Americans are gusanos and racists.
I think it's twofold. I think it's number one to get that out there, and for that person who's sort of on the fence or doesn't really understand it, but has some sympathy to the Cuban regime, because all they've ever seen is people wearing Che Guevara shirts, and they hear about how Cuba had wonderful healthcare and education, and how they drove out they get, as I call it, they get their history from The Godfather 2, right? Their Cuban history. They think that's what Cuba was before Fidel Castro. So it kind of reinforces it. But I think the other part is what communists do, which is intimidation. So, I fight back because, that's me. A lot of people, I don't want to get into this, flame throwing war.
Yeah, I mean, maybe less intimidation and more irritation. Like that's not
right, and it's like annoying. I don't want to deal with this. I don't, because every time I post something, about Cuba, I get 30 people going on there calling me names and all this stuff. So I don't. So they kind of like that, and I think that's the other part of it is just make it. If you're going to post about Cuba, you're going to pay a price for it. But I haven't seen them. It's been a while since I've gotten. I'll get mostly the tankies that will come in, into my mentions and tell me how I don't understand Cuba.
Right. And then on the other side of that coin, how has the blog led you and others involved with Babalu to connect to civilians in Cuba, right? Be they dissidents or whoever else. Like, talk a bit about that, which I imagine the farther down the history, the more recent history is one of more connection, because people over there have had more of a capacity to connect with you guys.
Yeah, it's sort of been. We actually had better connections before. I used to see traffic coming from Cuba. I haven't seen traffic from Cuba. In a while. I would suspect we're blocked.
For sure.
A lot of websites are blocked over there. So the social media has sort of taken over, as we were mentioning before, how social media has kind of become the gatekeeper for all information. It's taken over on that side. So a lot of the people that we meet have or that we talk to come in mostly from the social media side, but we're able to reach them, and they know who we are because of Babalu.
Yeah.
So it sort of plays its, Babalu has become an institution. Yeah. Not to, make us sound like we're an institution, but it's sort of, everybody knows, that's involved in the whole Cuban American and stuff. Everybody knows who Babalu. So it's sort of like not an unfamiliar. Who are these guys?
Right.
So
let's talk a little bit about and not to debate the politics of it, but talk about the conservative lean and I know that it's maybe not necessarily like built into black and white stated mission of Babalu to be conservative, but that's where it ends, and that's why you guys were dealing with like PJ with Pajamas Media and
Right.
Talk a bit about how you, especially as the managing editor, let's call it, do the math of what you want the balance to be. Because on the one hand, there's nothing wrong with having a perspective, but on the other hand, that can be taken so far as to maybe alienate an audience that you don't want to alienate, right? So just talk a bit about how you, as an editor, and also managing the other personalities that contribute to the website, right? Like anything else, there's people that maybe you don't want contributing, who may not be Castroites, but who you think have bad ideas, or whatever it might be. So just kind of talk through that, and I imagine that maybe your ideas about that have changed in whatever direction over time.
Well, first and foremost, we're anti-communists.
Sure.
Staunch anti-communists, which kind of eliminates 80% of people on the left side of the political spectrum.
Although they might not say that. So that's where
well,
the question becomes
interesting. they can not say it all they want, but
my
when they're promoting policies that are that
right.
are not anti-communist, that are the opposite, or let me put it a different way, when they are attacking policies that are promoted by anti-communists, and the perfect example is that you mentioned earlier, the very common theme that you hear, especially in the mainstream media. Those Cubans in Miami are all crazy.
Right.
They're all rabid, Castro, they're driven by hatred.
Which is a very common element of the argument for against the embargo, even from the anti-Castro Cuban-American set. They would say, well, I'm an anti-communist, but all of these other Cuban anti-communists who are pro-embargo are pro-embargo because they're crazy.
Right. So when you kind of marginalize somebody because you disagree with them on sanctions, and you marginalize them not because I disagree with the idea of sanctions don't work, but whatever point you have, but your argument is they're crazy,
right,
and have hatred in their hearts, and that's what drives them. Then where's the middle ground there? There is no middle ground.
Yeah, if you start impugning people's motives and
right.
character.
So I for instance, Senator Bob Menendez is a Democrat, Cuban-American Democrat. I disagree personally. I disagree with the vast majority of his policy positions, but I support him, and I have met him, and I have put stuff on our website. As we have shown how he stands up for freedom in Cuba. That's because we have one thing in common: freedom in Cuba and anti-communism.
Well, and so, and like I said, I don't want to get into. We can, but the
no, but I know what you're saying. This is
like from
a wormhole that you can,
from like an editorial perspective,
right?
Talk about how you draw those lines. Like, this is a website that is a home for this view or and not that one, or the Babalu position. The embargo is the easiest example, just because it's the one that we don't have to explain to people. So let's take that one as a case in point. How do you, as an editor, draw those lines of what kinds of views you're going to have coming from Babalu's own authors, what sorts of positions you're going to prioritize talking about, right? Because every site's got its mission,
right. I mean, our mission is, as I said, an island on the net without a bearded dictator. Our mission is anti-communism, and we believe, at least what is the management, the editorial board of Babalu, we believe the lifting the embargo or lifting sanctions would benefit the communist regime.
Yep.
We staunchly believe that. So would we let someone who believes otherwise write on, post an article on the blog? I have no problem, as long as the argument that they present is not people who don't agree with me are crazy and have hatred. If they can provide, an argument that, let the readers decide. I don't have a problem with that, as long as they're being honest and intellectually honest about it. I'm not going to allow them to lie about it.
Right.
It's not about censorship or whatever. Like the old thing, go make your own Twitter, go make your own blog site.
Right.
We're small. We're not, we don't control the narrative. We have a certain thing. Honesty for us, like I said, we've had people that disagree. You mentioned, Raíces.
Yeah.
I've met several people from Raíces that we don't agree on certain things, but we all have the same, desire.
So that's actually part of why I brought it up, and I'll give you a sense of where my head was in that in the Raíces Babalu comparison. Personally, I find myself agreeing more with the positions that I find on a Babalu. Raíces is also an organization or whatever we want to call it that has changed a lot over time since I was there, and I went my separate way from Raíces. This would have been like 2010. Back then, I think, and it's not that it should be Babalu's responsibility to be this, but what I think was lost when Raíces morphed, that I don't think anybody else in the Cuban-American activist sphere was doing, was that it was the lone, like, truly big tent, right? Like the crazy libertarian like me could be there. There were people who were working for the GOP who were in there and who were in leadership positions that that were above me in that hierarchy. And then, without getting into too much of at least my perspectives on what led that to falling apart, what was left after the some divisions in the organization was some of the more let's call them like center left or progressive set. Case in point, I'm very disconnected from the organization now, but what I see lately is that it's tough to think of a time that I saw the organization's name or logo come up where it wasn't also connected to Miami Freedom Project, which the Miami Freedom Project, I don't know, I imagine that you're familiar with them.
Vaguely.
Like when it first, because I knew a lot of people who had begun it, and at least back then, when it was first kind of becoming a thing, its own, founding group or whatever would talk about it in terms of it being not about Cuba. I don't think that it was ever intended to be a Cuba thing. It was about people being able to feel free to be progressive and Miamian, which I always thought was absurd. Like who's stopping you from being a Bernie voter? Like, what are you talking about? Like, as if this was like a problem for anybody. Like, you just don't. I don't know if you just don't like the conversations you're having at family reunions with your progressive with your conservative grandfather or something. Like, that's what you're not free in. But that I see Raíces even making statements in support of, for instance, these like new Biden policy changes, is something that when I was at Raíces would never have happened, precisely because we took the line of we institutionally will just allow our members or our affiliates or whatever to do stuff away from Raíces, and this will just be a home for all of the obvious consensus stuff where, like, unless you're in olive green fatigues, you have a home at Raíces. So that was where my head was when I was saying, like, I want to bring them up later because I'd like to get your thoughts, not on whether Babalu should be filling that void of being a big tent, but given how close you are to the issue, how do you see that sort of like balkanization of Cuban-American exile politics? Because there really is, I can't think of too many places where there aren't these beefs, right? That people can get together and actually deal with things that there's consensus on. As an example, like after the July 11th protests, I think there was almost nobody who disagreed that it was a good idea to raise money to charge Cuban cell phones, right? Even if you had to deal with DEXA, it was better that the phones be functioning than not functioning. These are the costs that you have to deal with.
Yeah. I mean, it's there's extremes in everything.
Like it would just my point. Like, Raíces used to be the place where a Babalu, whether in an official capacity or not, could be involved in the same project as like a Cuba study group, and a Miami Freedom Project and a Cuba Decide. I don't see that space, figuratively and literally, exists now. And I wonder, because you're still so engaged with the Cuba thing, if you see it differently.
No, you're absolutely right. That space, and I remember Babalu. We actually worked with Raíces.
Yeah.
We helped them when they were trying to get cell phones into Cuba, and we worked closely with several of the people there. And as I said, there could be policy disagreements,
Right.
on the best way to solve a problem. Once it starts the disagreements start becoming extreme, then it becomes problematic.
But I want to note, because I will probably insert some corny sound effect or something, we took a lunch break. There was chicken and risotto involved, and now we're back to wrap up the discussion. I guess a good place to end, because we can always do this again and kind of expound on other topics related to Cuba or to blogging, but is two things. So I want to start with just where do you see Babalú Blog going into the future, and put that in the context for me of where you see Cuban and Cuban exile political and human rights activism going into the future, right? Because you guys sort of exist in that context, and I'm sure that when you imagine what you'll be doing tomorrow, the most relevant question is, well, what will be going on in the Cuba sphere tomorrow? So how do you see the path ahead?
Well, it's definitely going to be a rocky path, because so much has changed and so much is changing in the whole internet, and the way information, the way social media has taken over. And so, for Babalu's going to evolve. It's going to continue to evolve. And as as we move into the future, we're going to have to adapt to the future, or it hasn't, or it's not going to survive. Now, as I said, 20 years is going to be 20 years that it's been around. I think, Babalu has created quite a legacy for itself. And if we were to shut it down tomorrow, it would, still be remembered by a lot of people, and it wouldn't be, fallen on the ash heap of history. But I'd like to see Babalu continue. I'd like to see it evolve. Things are changing so quickly on social media. And I know we discussed it earlier about, shadow bans and things of that nature. And I think a lot of that is going to change in the way it's going, whether, Elon Musk ends up buying Twitter and changes that, because that will trigger changes in other places. And, we'll evolve at that pace. And, we try to keep up. I get up every morning, and, I didn't mention this earlier, but Babalu is not, it's not a revenue generating website. It's a labor of love. We all pay to keep it up, and people can donate. We have a couple people are nice and help us out with paying for our server and the internet service and for the hosting service. But we basically pay for it. It's a labor of love. Nobody gets paid to write on Babalu.
Yeah.
So it'll continue as a labor of love, and as long as there's people who love Cuba, who love freedom, and love America, which is just as important, because that's what it's really all about. And one of the things about Cuban Americans that a lot of people that are not Cuban American, that did not grow up in Miami around Cuban Americans, don't really capture about the Cuban American psyche, is that Cuban Americans adore Cuba, and Cuban Americans adore America. And it's like a dual thing. It's for us. To me, it's not one or the other. It's both. And you're ready to do anything for them. This is your country, and I love this country. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else, but I love the country where my parents came from.
Right.
And I wouldn't want to be descendant of anything else. It's hard to describe to people who have been here for generations, and I imagine a lot of them, their great grandparents or great great grandparents that were the first generation that were here, whether they were German or Irish or Italian or Polish, whatever, probably felt something very similar to what we think. And I think it's that book, was it Berefimat, Living on the Hyphen? Kind of captures that essence where you're two people at the same time. You're two nationalities at the same time, and you can't extricate one from the other. So, that gets watered down as more generations. Like my kids didn't grow up the same way I grew up, and their kids won't grow up the same way that I grew up. But Cubans are it's a pretty strong, culturally, it's a very dominant culture. Yeah. And, you even see kids that are third, fourth generation Cuban, and in Miami, like for instance in Tampa, that's not the case. Right. Or in California, that's not the case. But in Miami, you grow up as a Cuban American, even if you're a fourth generation, you're still eating arroz con frijoles, picadillo, bistec de palomilla, yuca. You're still doing the lechon on Nochebuena. That culture stays very strong. Yeah. So that kind of like makes us unique.
Are there? I think one thing. This isn't necessarily. I don't know everybody who has contributed or contributes to Babalu, but one of the things that kind of characterizes it is that, like you said, it's people who feel very Cuban and very American. Are there people, whether it's blogging or social media, right, because the landscape has changed and what it means to be engaged online on the issue is different, who are either in Cuba or left Cuba more recently, that you see what they're doing and you're excited by it, or you're interested in it, or you see it as like a valuable like component of that broader landscape of Cuban and Cuban American media?
I mean, in media?
Well, yeah, I mean, and media very broadly defined, like including Babalu in media.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing a lot of, for instance, a lot of the artists that that are coming out of Cuba now. The Yotuels and El Osorbo and even going to the Aldeanos to Gorky Aguila and Polo para Ricardo. You kind of see that's something that's again part of the Cuban culture is very strong artistic component to it. So that kind of moves into the media side, and you see media personalities that are coming out, influencers on, and I know we had discussed that in the past, influencers that are on social media that are Cuban, that just got here more, that had gotten here more recently. Yeah. And you kind of see that same, they come from it from a different perspective because they grew up in a different, in a different environment. You got someone that's, 28 years old here that got here, 6 years ago. They spent 22 years of their life standing in line, growing up under a Stalinist, society. But the thing that affects you.
Yeah, the thing that I find so interesting, though, is that, and it's a very recent phenomenon, is that I don't even want to say this generation, right? Because even older Cubans who are online are able to connect with the current Cuban reality or the more recent Cuban immigrant experience in a way that was impossible before. So, like, one guy that comes to mind that maybe you've come across him is Frank Camayeris. He was doing vlog type content on YouTube from Cuba, and it was great. And it was a lot of kind of daily life stuff, but you could tell that he was kind of pushing the envelope a little bit of how much you could get away with. Like, this is what I eat in a given day, and it was some of the stuff was like pan con aceite. It's like it's better than nothing, but there were all those subtle little things. So yeah, I think that there's. It's a richer online Cuban picture, I think, than there was before. And I think that you guys with Babalu, in a lot of ways, were like a proof of concept of how something that niche. Because I think Cubans tend to have this idea of like there's not that many of us. We matter in Miami, but people barely know where Cuba is when you leave Miami. And I think that you guys prove that you could have an impact.
No, I mean, and that's something as a Cuban that I always find hilarious. And you've traveled as well. I find Cubans everywhere you go, and the most remote places that you would never expect. I'll never forget skiing in Colorado and getting with some family and friends, and we're up on the top of a mountain, and it's like 6 of us, and we're all, oye, pero tú sabes, yo me voy a tirar por acá. And then all of a sudden we start hearing similar sounds, like 50 feet away, and it's another big group, and ustedes son cubanos.
Yeah.
Sí, yo soy cubano.
It's like you're a bunch of dolphins, like, and you hear each other's dolphin noises.
And you hear the stuff, and you find them. This is on a mountain in Colorado. So Cubans kind of tend, a lot of people think that the Cuban American community is Miami, and it's all we do. But when you look at Cuban Americans that have had influence and have had impact on society, on business and politics, they're all over the country.
Yeah, sure.
They come from all over the place. So I don't think it has as much to do with the strength in numbers, because there's always strength in numbers, but there's for the Cubans, I think the strength comes in the unity.
Sure.
And you don't necessarily have to be living right next to each other to have unity.
Right.
We have unity with Cubans in Tampa, except for their Cuban sandwiches. We have unity, with the Cubans in Union City, New Jersey, with the Cubans that are in California, with Marta in California. We have unity with all these different Cubans. That Babalú Blog kind of became that meeting place where all the Cubans that in the diaspora that were spread all over the world. Right. I mean, we get them from all over the world, kind of all met, and I think that's one of the things that Babalú Blog provided, and I think continues to provide for Cubans, even though a lot of them, a lot of people are using social media for that as well. But social media, you got to cut through a lot of stuff to get to where you want to go. Where in Babalú, you get there and you're with your fellow Cubans.
Yeah. So just in the interest of doing something timely, I want to end, before we do our signing off stuff, on just a brief getting your thoughts on these Biden administration policy changes, which I know has been, from following Babalu a little bit, has been what you wake up and do immediately is think and read about this stuff. So just for the people listening, I've pulled up the State Department summary. I'll read the headers of that bulleted list of what the changes were, but
so I can fisk it like they used to say in the blogging days.
All right. So blah blah blah. Specifically, the administration will 1. Facilitate reunification by reinstating the Cuban Family Reunification Parole Program and continuing to increase capacity for consular services. And of course, there's a little more detail here, but in the interest of brevity. 2. Strengthen family ties and facilitate educational connections for the U.S. and Cuban people by expanding authorized travel in support of the Cuban people. We will authorize scheduled and charter flights to locations beyond Havana. We will also implement, and I'm reading more of this one because I think it's more of interest to people. We will also implement regulatory changes to reinstate group people-to-people and other categories of group educational travel, as well as certain travel related to professional meetings and professional research, including to support expanded internet access and remittance processing companies, and to provide additional support to Cuban entrepreneurs. We are not reinstating individual people-to-people travel. Next, increase support for independent Cuban entrepreneurs. I've already seen news, sidebar, of Treasury or
authorizing it. We still don't, to my knowledge, we still don't know who.
Right, exactly. So somebody to invest in some
but we don't know
some business in Cuba.
And I think I know why they haven't said who it is.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can get into that. And then finally, ensure that remittances flow more freely to the Cuban people while not enriching those who perpetrate human rights abuses. Specifically, we will remove the current limit on family remittances of $1,000 per quarter per sender receiver pair, and will authorize donative remittances, i.e. non-family remittances, which will support independent Cuban entrepreneurs. We will engage with electronic payment processors to encourage increased Cuban market accessibility. We will not remove entities from the Cuba restricted list. So, before asking you what your thoughts are, this to me reads like a list of things that either A, they'd already intended to do before any of these protests July 11th. This was the kind of thing that Biden and Biden's Cuba people...
it's basically the Obama policy.
Right. But then also, there are all these like things in there that to me, right, and I wasn't in the meetings. I haven't spoken to anybody who helped put this stuff together, at least not since this. I'm sure I know some of the people who were involved in drafting some of this. Some of it reads to me like, for instance, the thing about remittances, engaging payment processors to encourage increased Cuban market accessibility without removing entities from the Cuba restricted list. So all you've really said there is that you're going to open up remittance amount allowances without changing who the remittances can go through. And you're just, for rhetorical purposes, assuming that you'll be able to engage payment processors who can work around the Cuban government to get remittances legally to Cubans on the island. None of it makes any sense. No,
that's all rhetorical.
Exactly. It just feels like a bunch of stuff that's peppered into this laundry list of a progressive wish list of Cuba policy to placate even like moderate Cuban Americans. And we were talking earlier over our chicken and risotto about how different this point in time is, and how many people who in the past have been open about preferring engagement are at least now, even if only saying that it's in the context of this moment of like heightened protest and extra, like even by Cuban standards, extraordinary human rights abuse, saying that no, this is not the time for this sort of thing. So, and that's to say nothing of whether that's the right or the wrong position. Personally, I'm kind of I don't want to say engagement, but I'm sort of an embargo agnostic. I've been of the mind that what we've been doing hasn't worked, but I also acknowledge, I think that what we've been doing has been, and I think most people can agree with it has been an embargo in name only. And I think that both, like the totally open it up and the totally shut it down, both have more logic to them than the status quo argument, right? So, with all of that blabbering as context, what's your reaction been, especially now with a few days to process these announcements?
Well, basically going down that list, if all they did was number one,
right, which, to refresh people's memory, was the facilitating family reunification.
Right, which really had nothing to do with sanctions. It had to do with Havana syndrome, which it makes no mention of in there, why consular services had to be shut down in Cuba. And COVID, which obviously had its effect.
Havana syndrome being the audio or
the sonic attack, the sonic attacks or whatever it is, attacks that took place in Cuba.
Right.
That you'd have to be completely naive to believe that the Cuban government had I don't think the Cuban government has the resources to pull that off, but somebody does.
Right.
And the Cuban government knew about it because you can't walk down the street in Cuba and pass gas without state security knowing about it.
And these sonic attacks was basically the entire consulate had a headache.
Well, they had a headache, and they actually had
they
actually had brain damage.
Right. But I'm being euphemistic about it. But
right. But I'm saying it wasn't like this. They tried to pass it off as crickets. They tried to pass it off as mass hysteria. And then it's been happening. It happened in China. Mm-hmm. But either way, that not to go down that side road.
Yeah.
But that's
makes
the
no
first
mention
one,
of how that
why that was a problem to begin with. Number two, what was the number two? The travel.
Number two was the people to people stuff. So strengthening family ties and facilitating educational connections. So they're basically reintroducing people to people and the academic trips and that kind of stuff.
Right. But of course, all these academic trips are between, universities and colleges and learning institutions here in the U.S. and state-run institutions
Right.
in Cuba. So
Yeah, for Americans to go to Havana and be lectured on economics by a communist professor.
exactly. So, what is that going to get us? What are we going to... And it's happening over there. It's not like they're sending their people here
Right.
to, they do send their people here for a conference to lecture Americans here in the U.S. about economics. But, that's not really, that just works for them, and it works for their propaganda, and it works for them to recruit more people to go back to the United States and say how wonderful Cuba is. And then in terms of the
entrepreneur bit.
The entrepreneur bit, I find that amazing, because they refuse to ever mention the fact that once they started, like for instance, when Cuba changed the law and allowed private businesses to open, a bunch of restaurants opened in Havana, and a bunch of those restaurants are owned by generals, the children of generals and high-ranking officials, and probably, I forget the name of it now, but the most popular one in Cuba.
Yeah, I forget,
but you know which one I'm talking about. That Madonna ate there, and Jay-Z and Beyonce and all that. That's owned by the son of a general in the Cuban military.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are the people in Cuban society who have the resources to...
Well, it's actually owned by the communist elite.
Right. Yeah, and the ones who can get the licensing.
And the ones who not only can get the license, they're the ones that can get the steak, that can get the lobster, that can get all the stuff, because, Joseito Sopla, Joe Blow, opens up a little, hamburger stand.
Yeah.
Where's he going to get the ground beef?
Right.
He can't, he's not going to get ground beef. He's going to have to go out in the street and find it, and, buy it on the black market to be able to make hamburgers. So... Which
even some of these people in powerful positions are buying it on the black market. The issue is that they look the other way and don't.
They're buying it on the black market because, number one, they got the cash.
Right.
And number two, they're still getting a better price. Than they're ripping themselves off. Yeah. Because they have no problem with that. But, the entrepreneurial thing and going with that they opened, and I find it so odd that, this is because this was something that, I actually would love to be able to get money.
Right.
Directly to Cuban entrepreneurs that want to open. I would love to be able to facilitate that.
Right. Yeah, there's this caricature of the conservative Cuban position that makes it seem like almost as though like your interest is in spiting any Cuban anywhere.
Right. I would love to be able, because I have family in Cuba. I would love to be able to send them money to open up a little business, and they can make money and become self-sufficient. I would love to do that.
Yeah.
But I can't. Not because the U.S. government won't let me, because the Cuban government won't let them.
Right.
So if they found this way to get a U.S. investor to invest in a private Cuban investor there, and they were able to make that connection, and, they made a press release that they're going to allow it, why aren't they saying who it is?
Well, and then the other interesting thing is... saying interesting sort of euphemistically, but even if the Cuban government may very well allow it, the issue is if the whole premise of this is to do this without enriching people in the Cuban government, then you can't have it both ways, right? Even if you do find a payment processor where there's no skimming.
Oh, that's another thing.
Right. You still are establishing a business ostensibly above board that has to pay fees, whether it's licensing or permits or taxes or whatever, to the Cuban government, and they are those are like confiscatory taxes and fees and all that to an absurd degree. So there's no getting around it, and
even if they would do it for free,
right?
You still have the situation where you're sending U.S. dollars to Cuba, and let's say the Cuban government says, look, we're not going to skim anything off the top. Mm-hmm. We're going to send the money directly to them. But the only way they're going to do that is if they're going to get those 100 U.S. dollars, to say a number.
Right.
And they're going to say, hey, Jose, I got money here from your cousin. I'm going to give it to you, but I'm going to give it to you in Cuban pesos.
Right, which is effectively a skimming. But
right, but they're going to say, hey, I didn't charge anything. And my, now the exchange rate on the street, dollars to CUP, I think it's, 1,000 to 1 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go to the bank, it's 250 to 1. So they're going to say, they sent me 100, here's 2,500 CUP. Where if you would have gotten those $100 in cash, you would have gotten 10,000 on the street CUP. So the Cuban government, and they know it's not worth it. So they're always going to get something. So there's no way unless you can get them U.S. dollars directly into their hands, which a lot of people who go to Cuba do. A lot of people who go back to visit their family bring them wads of cash, hoping it doesn't, because if they customs finds it, they're gonna confiscate.
Yeah, you'd rather pay for a flight and take wads of cash than
right. So, and then the wads of cash, they can, unless you can find a way to do it that way. Look, I understand it costs money to run a money services business and an exchange house, and I don't, as long as they charge something that's shouldn't charge more than what it would cost me to send money to Colombians to send money to their family in Colombia, or Mexicans to Mexico. It should be a set percentage, 3, 4, 5, 6%.
Yeah, there's some sense of what the market demands.
Right. Of what it costs to run that and make a profit and go. But number one, they take 10% right off the top, plus transaction fees, plus the exchange rate.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. So there's really no way to do it without the Cuban government giving it up. But they're going to push it through anyways.
So if you're, and we'll end here. If you are, let's say that you're the president, or you've got somebody who would reflect your values, there's how do you square that circle, right? And it's not an easy circle to square, but square the circle of, yes, I would like to see money be able to make it from people here to people there, but no, I don't want for any part of that process to enrich the Cuban government. And for me, and this isn't something that I would expect the Biden administration or frankly any other administration of either party to do, but I would love to see something more along the lines of, we regard this government as illegitimate, and so what we're putting in place is some kind of protection for any American citizen who tries to do all this in violation of Cuban law, right? These are the ways that we're cool with, that they're not cool with. And if you go this far, then when I was in Cuba, this was 08-09, I went I went legally from the U.S. side, but at the time you needed trip-specific licenses, so I went on democracy promotion licenses of other organizations. And I still went through third countries, right? I did the whole papelazo of acting as though I were breaking embargo law. But you wanted that permission from Treasury so that they were aware of your being there, and so that they had signed off on the whole thing, so that if the shit did hit the fan and you ended up in a Cuban jail or something, it sort of it made it more plausible, made it easier to get the help of the U.S. government.
Right.
If you ran into some kind of trouble helping Cuban people in violation of Cuban law, which I was absolutely doing. I would love to see that approach that we're already using, right? Because people are still going to Cuba to do things that are illegal in Cuba, and so long as they have given a heads up to state or to the Treasury Department, you can get the help of the U.S. government ostensibly while you're in Cuba. I don't quite understand why more Cubans, especially the ones who want more engagement and exchange and more money changing hands, don't go that route, right? Don't say, okay, we want this to happen. We agree, even with the hardest of the hard line, that in an ideal world, we don't want this money ending up in the hands of the state. So what can we do to protect the people who actually stick their necks out and go to help Cubans do things on the black market? Whether that's cryptocurrencies, which, again, I don't expect a Democratic White House to be, shunning fiat currency as a tool for freedom. So that's where you sort of run into some of that stuff. But what does it look like for you? That's what it looks like for me. But when you imagine, I would love it if this announcement said X, Y, and Z, what might that be?
the thing is, it's a challenge because you have a totalitarian government that's there that doesn't allow. I think what you bring up is a good way to look at it. It's like you're not going to be able to force them to not skim remittances. You're not going to be able to force them to give up revenue. But if there's the whole carrot stick thing. Mm-hmm. Like if you do this, we'll do that.
Right.
So if you allow remittances to go in directly and Cubans to transact in U.S. dollars and receive the U.S. dollars directly with no more than 6% transaction fees, we'll open up zero, there'll be no restrictions on how much money they can send. Mm-hmm. Because at that point, the Cuban government is going to have to say, I'm getting 10% of to say a number, $1 billion. Hell, I'd rather get 5% of $10 billion.
Right.
That's a lot more money.
Yeah.
They're not stupid. They may be communists, but they're not stupid. So that would be something that the carrot and the stick, and I think that's something that could kind of. And I don't know. I'm not thinking of all the unintended consequences. No, I'm just throwing ideas out there.
Right.
Where you sort of give up on a little on something, and they give up a lot. Where you can have the advantages. Now, if you can flood money into there, not into the coffers of the regime, because right now all the anti-embargo people, that their idea has been to what I call it is, their plan is to take down the regime by drowning it in cash. Right. I'm going to pour so much money on them that they're not going to be able to breathe and they're going to die. That's never happened.
And I think the thing that I think is so difficult for people who are not necessarily engaged in this all that deeply to wrap their heads around is they imagine that the pushback on this is that, they're going to become more repressive, right? I don't think that's quite the argument. I think it's more this cash, like it or not, those July 11th protests, yes, they were about freedom, they were about choice and democracy and all of these things, but the fuel, the thing that, that straw that broke the camel's back was quality of life crisis. And to inject cash into that system necessarily alters the temperature and puts off the pressure, right? Relieves some of the pressure on the Cuban state that had existed, at other times when they did liberalize little bits and pieces of the economy. Just what the evidence shows over and over and over again, and I think you would agree with this, is that they respond to that pressure by allowing for more liberty, and inevitably somebody comes in and gives them the wiggle room to shut the valve off again. And this is what this feels like to me. Is that this is the thing that gives them that makes it more comfortable for them to shut the valve off again, and then they won't have to be all that repressive because they can go back to 2018 levels of repression of just running a dictatorship where people are skating by and more concerned with survival because they're worried that survival will be threatened tomorrow. July 11th, survival felt like it was being threatened right then, and people said, hasta aquí llegamos. This is the line.
Look, I think everybody, a lot of people, especially when it comes to the embargo, a lot of people are like, imagine if we didn't have the embargo and, we had American tourists and, imagine how things would, the Cuban government. Look, yes, the embargo has not worked.
Right.
Has not toppled the regime. But you know what? 30 years and hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in Cuba by Canada, Europe,
right,
China. I don't want to count China because they're not.
Spain. Debt's being forgiven too.
Debt forgiven. All that pouring into Cuba has had only one effect: make the regime richer and giving them the resources.
Yeah.
So if we didn't have any sanctions against Cuba, our relationship with the U.S. relationship with Cuba would be no different than the relationship that Canada currently has with Cuba, which is basically a trading partner that now has so much money and so many interests, business interests in Cuba, that they are forced to defend Cuba on the international stage because Cuba now has them by the proverbial,
right.
You know what? And they say, you either defend us, or you know what? That, all those hotels you got here, we're just gonna, we are communists after all. We could just say tomorrow, hey, this belongs to the people.
Right. And you wouldn't be able to pretend like you didn't know we were communists all along.
And, you're going to go to international court? Go ahead.
Right.
We're communists.
Yeah. And I can even understand.
And that's why I was saying that's what my point is, that everybody says, oh, the embargo hasn't worked. Well, neither has the other part.
Right. And I can even understand the position of liberalized trade all the way, and you do that at your own risk, and the U.S. government is going to be, agnostic. I don't know if that's necessarily my preferred position, but I can understand the idea of opening up trade doesn't mean, kowtowing the way the Canadians do.
Well, but here's the thing. American companies can sell all the food, all the medicine they want to Cuba.
Right.
All.
Cash up front, though.
But it has to be cash up front.
Right.
So when they come and they say, oh, there's the blockade,
right.
Or they're blocking food, no, they're not. Because it has to be cash up front. Because otherwise, who gets stuck with the bill? If Cuba doesn't pay, the U.S. taxpayer does.
Well, so that's what I'm saying is, and I agree with you, that's probably the way that it plays out, is that if the U.S. government allowed people to extend credit to Cuba, then the U.S. government, people like to pretend that bailouts are only for the biggest banks. A farmer would get bailed out. Right. But if in the hypothetical, the unrealistic, I admit, hypothetical, where you can actually say the U.S. government will not bail you out, I can see the argument. I can almost see that argument also, in other words, of allowing for that trade and allowing for the extension of that credit without the possibility of getting bailed out. I think some people might finally learn their lesson. Right.
Well, but here's the thing. They could do that today.
Right, but they won't.
There's no need for a change in policy, because if a farmer wants to sell grain to Cuba and Cuba doesn't have the cash, all the farmer has to do is tell Cuba, go find someone to finance it for you.
Sure. It's an added step, though. I mean,
but the thing is that
it's possible.
Not only is it possible, it's happening right now, because Cuba doesn't have the cash. Cuba's borrowing money to be able to buy the chicken and the rice and everything that they buy from.
But to add steps is a barrier, and is a market barrier.
No, I know. But the thing is, one thing is adding a step, and and then you have the other extreme, which is, we're going to pay you, and if Cuba doesn't pay, don't worry about it. You still get your money, because the U.S. taxpayer is going to be stuck with it.
Yeah. No. I'm not saying that no version of that happens now.
No. But the point being that it's really, if anything, the U.S. embargo has saved the U.S. U.S. taxpayer billions of dollars.
And that's an aspect of it that I think even the embargo's proponents, especially on the national stage, don't talk about enough. Right?
No.
It's framed so often as this is about forcing democratic change in Cuba, and the easy answer is always, well, it hasn't done that.
But that's not the reason it was put in place to begin with.
No, I agree. I understand that. 100%. That's the history of it. But you hear it so seldom, and it's the obvious argument to me, even in those days or in those moments when I'm least pro-embargo. It's the obvious argument, because the democratic change thing, the regime change thing, sounds nice, but it's a hypothetical. Whereas if you're talking to anybody who thinks that the U.S. government, and this is especially true on the left, that the U.S. government has a duty and the authority to protect consumers, then you can easily make the case that the U.S. embargo on Cuba protects U.S. consumers every single day, right now, like at this moment. No, there is somebody who's being protected.
As a matter of fact, I mean, as I'm sure most, if not all, of your listeners know, the U.S. embargo, the embargo on Cuba was placed because of the expropriation of U.S. owned property with no compensation.
Right. which I believe has never happened. Like, at least for pennies on the dollar,
Well,
it's happened elsewhere.
China paid off
Right.
what they expropriated. Vietnam paid off what they
Right.
expropriated. Everybody does that. It's part of, it's if you want to operate and deal with the United States,
Right.
you don't completely screw them over.
Right.
So Cuba decided we're not going to do it. Why? Because they had the luxury. I got the Soviet Union that's, pouring cash into here. I don't even need to deal with you.
Mm-hmm.
And for decades, the Cuban government didn't even deal with the U.S. Didn't buy anything didn't need to, because the Soviet Union was sending them all their stuff. When they finally started to find the need, they started, I think it was during the Carter years, they offered to, okay, we'll pay you, but we're going to pay you in Cuban bonds, which aren't even worth the paper they're going to be printed on.
Yeah.
But
there might be more value in this old Cuban lottery ticket that I have
Right.
up here.
And, a lot of people say, oh, well, the embargo gives the Cuban government an excuse. Like, you really think somebody who's been in power for 60 years, that's the only excuse they've used to stay
Yeah.
in power for 60 years? We can remove the embargo tomorrow. And the day after tomorrow, the Cuban government will say, well, yes, you should have never put it in place. And by the way, our economists came up with this number. You owe us $552 billion of the money we lost during that whole embargo. And until you pay us that, we will not be made whole.
Right.
And then that will become the new talking point. And then when you pay them for the $552 billion, they'll say, well, it was actually, you took so long, it was actually $700 billion. You still owe us $2. It never ends. It'll always be something, one thing after the other. They will always have a problem. They'll come up with something new, remove the embargo, and they're going to use something else.
Right.
So that's not a valid.
Yeah. So I think we can wrap it up there. I'll let you say whatever other thing you want to say, and then also shamelessly plug all of your stuff, all of Babalu's stuff.
Well, no, I mean, I just want to say I'm really happy to see you, and it's been so long.
Same.
I know we were supposed to get together right before COVID. We were talking about getting together for lunch, and then COVID hit, and then we'll say, oh, in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Let's postpone it for 2 weeks. And those 2 weeks finally were over, but I'm glad I got to see you. Glad to be on the podcast with you. And, as you mentioned, babalooblog.com. You guys are all welcome to go there. You can put in your name and your email address, and get on our mailing list, and we'll email it to you every single morning. Like, with your Cuban cafecito, you can have your dose of Babalú Blog.
Very good. Shameless plugs for the Liberated Podcast. You can find the Liberated Podcast at dademag.com/liberated. Give us all of your money at patreon.com/dademag. You can join one of any number of tiers there. There's some perks involved. You might get coffee in the mail, all kinds of stuff happening. Also, listen to our other podcasts, Pan Con Podcast, hosted by Chef and 8th grade basketball MVP Michael Beltran, and Step Into the Sandbox, hosted by David Berjano. That is all conversations with creative types. We've had musicians and DJs and photographers and all kinds of interesting stuff there. I am probably forgetting a thing, but whatever. What are you going to do? This thing has been, I've made a mess of this thing enough by now.
It's been fun. It's been fun.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you.